My name is Abdul Basir Hassan, Al Jazeera reporter in Cairo. I'd like to know why you've chosen Cairo to hold this conference for the first time. Second, I'd like to know how you see the performance of the Egyptian military leaders during the past year since the revolution of 25th of January. Thank you.
We chose Cairo because it's the capital of the Arab world. And the focus of this year's report is obviously developments in the Arab world and the international reaction to them. So this is the logical place to hold the press conference. As for the performance of the Egyptian military, the SCAF, it started off positively in terms of protecting the demonstrators and facilitating the departure of Mubarak. But it's taken a very disturbing turn. And the Egyptian military seems, at this point, determined to try to carve out an exception to democratic rule for its area of power and interest. We hope that is resisted. But what we've seen is a series of moves that are disturbing. The continuation of the emergency law, and with that, of course, the use of emergency state security courts, the continued trial of civilians before military tribunals. These are all steps that undermine the rule of law. We've seen a continuation of the excessive use of lethal force, highlighting the urgency of police reform, of stressing that lethal force should be the last resort, a resort used only in response to a lethal threat, as international standards require, rather than something that's used quite quickly after warning has been given. So there needs to be, quite radical reform in the way that the police and the security forces respond to demonstrations in the street or any kind of disturbance. There are rules to be followed under international law, which the military and its surrogates in the security forces have not been following. And finally, the military, has shown itself to be quite thin-skinned when it comes to both criticisms of it and popular demonstrations. The military doesn't seem to yet understand that democracy is not simply a matter of having an election. Democracy is also a matter of having a vigorous press and a vigorous civil society. And so the military is going to have to learn to live with criticism. It can't be arresting bloggers or journalists who simply say something critical about the military. The military is going to have to stop authorizing these harassment investigations into NGOs. There's something deeply ironic about a military that is, very dependent on international aid, objecting to NGOs receiving modest international assistance. And of course, the real problem here is that the military has still refused to register NGOs, which should be a perfunctory matter, a mere administrative matter of NGOs providing basic information to the authorities and getting registered and licensed to operate. The military continues to refuse to allow basic human rights NGOs to function in a legally prescribed way, and that has been the basis of these new harassment investigations. Those should stop. So what we'd like to see is much greater political space for basic freedoms, and not simply in the electoral area where political parties are now competing, but also in the realm of civil society and the press.
You mentioned specific recommendations for the Arab League meeting today on Syria. I was wondering if you could say what those recommendations are, and also speak a bit about the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the Arab League. What is it capable of, what should it be doing, and what are its limitations?
Well, the Arab League has obviously taken some exceptional steps over the last year, which we very much acknowledge. Its endorsement of pressure on Gaddafi, and its willingness to step in and make sincere efforts to try to curb Assad's repression. I think it's widely understood, though, that the deployment of the observers over the last month has been disappointing in a couple of respects. First of all, the killing has continued. Hundreds have died while the observers were in place. The promised end to the killing hasn't occurred. Indeed, Assad has played games with the observers by hiding prisoners, by moving around forces, not genuinely removing the forces from cities as he had promised to do. I think it's widely understood that it's widely expected that today the Arab League will continue at least for another month the presence of the observers. But we hope the Arab League does that in a way that maximizes their effectiveness in stopping the killing. And that's going to require, I think, two things. First, a change in the way the observers operate, and second, a change in the Arab League's attitude toward using further pressure on Assad. And let me explain what I mean. With respect to the way the observers operate, so far they have operated largely secretly and without transparency. They have not been publicly reporting their findings, which is the best way of maximizing the effect of the observers. You know, it's wrong to expect that merely having an observer there is going to deter Assad. The best way to deter killing is for the observers to regularly and publicly report on what they're seeing. That has not been what's happening. Indeed, we don't even know the terms of reference for the observers. You know, what are the rules governing their activities in Syria? How were the observers chosen? This has all been very obscure. And we hope the Arab League will open this up because it'll make the process much more effective. Second, we hope the Arab League makes clear today that if Assad continues to kill, if this second month's deployment of observers doesn't stop the killing, that the Arab League is going to look to the UN Security Council to ratchet up the pressure. Now, this does not mean the red herring of military intervention, the excuse that Russia and China have used to block Security Council action. Instead, they're very important steps far short of military intervention, that have nothing to do with military intervention, that the Arab League could ask for from the Security Council. And what we have in mind is, first of all, the kind of targeted sanctions on Assad and his entourage to make clear to them that there is a cost to continued killing. Second, an arms embargo so that Russia cannot continue to supply the bullets and the guns used to kill demonstrators. And third, referral to the International Criminal Court to make clear that if you continue to commit crimes against humanity, you will ultimately find yourself brought to The Hague. Those kinds of steps, even the threat of doing that, the public threat of doing that at the end of the second month, should the killing not stop, would greatly increase the influence of the Arab League observers in curtailing the repression in Syria. But if the Arab League simply, allows the observers to go back in for another year, another month, operating in the same secretive way as they have, without mentioning the possibility of ratcheting up the pressure, that's almost a recipe for a continuation of the status quo. And this is an unacceptable status quo. It is not helpful for the Arab League to simply have people in there watching as Assad keeps killing and have no consequences result. We hope the Arab League takes that message today, and when it predictably extends the observers, it does so in a way that maximizes the possibility of ending the killing. Yes, Becca.
I want to ask about the UN role in facing all these violations, especially until now they can vote to stop killing in Syria, but they do this in Libya. Thank you.
When you ask about the role of the United Nations in Syria, it's important to recognize that there are two parts to the United Nations. There's the Secretariat under Ban Ki-moon, and then there's the part of the United Nations which is basically a conference room where the governments of the world meet, in this case, the Security Council. Now, as for the Secretariat, Ban Ki-moon has been very outspoken. His High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, has been very outspoken. They've been doing what they can to investigate and condemn the ongoing atrocities. The Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council under the guidance of Navi Pillay also has been very effective. So that part has been as good as you could expect. The problem has arisen much more in the political bodies. We've seen strong action by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. We've seen a positive resolution by the UN General Assembly in New York. But when it comes to the political body that matters the most, the political party that is the only one capable of imposing sanctions and ratcheting up the cost of the killing, that is the UN Security Council, we've seen basically nothing. There's a reason for that. And I'd like to assign blame, in the first instance to Russia and China because they were the ones who vetoed. But it's also worth noting that India, South Africa, and Brazil also bear significant responsibility. Because if those three key southern democracies had voted for increasing the pressure on Assad, imposing sanctions, imposing an arms embargo, referring Syria to the International Criminal Court, if those three southern democracies had insisted on those steps, it would have been very difficult for Russia and China, standing alone, to block the Security Council from acting. That's the lesson we learned from the first Libya resolution, which basically did that same thing. That when the southern democracies went along with ratcheting up the sanctions, Russia and China would not stand isolated in the embarrassing position of doing nothing about the ongoing killing. But when the major southern democracies were willing to close their eyes, when they were not willing to stand up for the rights abroad that they respect at home, Russia and China felt quite comfortable in vetoing. And that's the situation we face today. So while I do blame first and foremost Russia and China, they're the ones who vetoed, responsibility also lies on the leading governments of the global south to stand up for the principles that they articulate at home, that they say they abide by home, and recognize that just as a Brazilian or an Indian or South African has a right not to be summarily shot for having a public demonstration, so does a Syrian. And it's time for those governments to vote those principles in the Security Council.
Have there been any talks with the political Islam groups in Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria? And are you comfortable with the rise to the political scene? Thank you.
Well, I should say, Human Rights Watch has regularly spoken with, with a range of political parties, including the Islamists in all the countries you've mentioned, including here. And we've not only spoken for years with the Muslim Brotherhood here, we actively worked on their behalf to try to liberate their prisoners from custody, to try to strengthen the political space in which they operated. So, Human Rights Watch has long had relations with the Muslim Brotherhood. We recognize that today they're saying a lot of the right things, that their rhetoric has been largely good. There have been some exceptions, but overall we're encouraged by that. But frankly, the proof is going to be in the pudding. The proof is going to be in how they actually govern. And what we hope they recognize is that you cannot pick and choose among freedoms without jeopardizing all freedoms. The Muslim Brotherhood is obviously most interested in the kind of traditional political freedoms, the ones that allow them to get elected to parliament. But it's very difficult to have secure political freedoms if you are not at the same time respecting religious freedoms or respecting the rights of women. You can't pick and choose among rights without jeopardizing them all. We hope that that is a message that the Muslim Brotherhood, as a new governing body, will hear and live by. And we'll be watching this closely. Well, the question is, what are we particularly concerned about? We're concerned about, foremost, the rights of women and the rights of religious and other minorities. Those are the real tests.
Some people are afraid of what may happen in the next Wednesday, 25th of January. Do we share the same fears? The next question, do you think the revolution in the Middle East have accomplished their goals?
Obviously we're very worried about what happens. There should be a right to protest on January 25th, and we hope the military recognizes that, and that they don't resort to violence. There has been a tendency recently for the military to somehow view, to feel that it has a duty to suppress any demonstration. And that's wrong. That's not democracy. And so, and that is one of the major shortcomings of the revolution so far, the fact that the military continues to act in this way in similar ways, to restrain basic freedoms, to continue the emergency law and the like.
Egypt is still undergoing a transition period with on one side now an elected parliament, on the other a military that has been in charge of the country for some 60 years. And when you look at some of the recent events, such as the over 100 people who were killed since October by military and police, and the question of accountability for that. First, do you think that it's understandable that there might be some compromise between the military and these political forces much like there was compromise in the 1980s in South America, in Chile, for instance, with the military establishment? And secondly, do you feel that, how do you feel about the US and generally the Western reaction to the events of the recent months and the question of whether conditionality should be put on future aid to Egypt, whether military or economic?
Well, first of all, in terms of any compromises that the elected parliament might be inclined to make with the military, it's important to recognize that this is the formative moment of Egyptian democracy, and that precedents set now are difficult to reverse in the future. Our goal, I think Egyptians' goal, should be to build the rule of law as an essential element of democracy. You can't have democracy if government authorities live above the law. Democracy is not just something to rule ordinary people, it's also to rule the government. And so if people are inclined to cut deals, to sort of sweep serious abuses under the rug in the name of moving forward, I think one has to recognize that one's moving forward with a very bad precedent. And certainly reforming the security forces is a key goal for the new parliament. It must be. And not simply the military. Obviously, the military has only been in a position where it is exercising abusive authority more recently. Historically, it's been more the Interior Ministry. But there is an urgent need to address the systematic use of torture, the systematic use of excessive force. And if those abuses are simply swept under the rug, it would be very difficult to create new security forces that are respectful of the rule of law, because there will have been a very visible precedent to the contrary that is set. As for the Western reaction, the Western at a rhetorical level, the West has become much more outspoken in pressing for the military to relinquish power, in opposing things like the crackdown on NGOs or the use of excessive violence against demonstrators. And we believe that that's for the good. Your question about conditionality, I mean, obviously the US Congress has now imposed conditionality on US aid, so it's no longer a question of if, it has happened. And indeed, I think that's not to be unexpected. Most people, when they send aid, give aid because they believe in the actions of the recipient. And as I mentioned, it is an essential element of democracy that civil society be free. It's an essential element of democracy that security forces not use excessive lethal force. And I don't think it's at all surprising that Western donors are looking for positive evolution on those fronts. Obviously, no one wants to cut off aid to Egypt at a point when it urgently needs it. But Egyptians foremost have an interest in seeing their government act in a democratic way. And when these harassment investigations of NGOs are launched, when demonstrators are shot using excessive force, those actions are viewed negatively, not simply by the West, but frankly by most Egyptians. And that's why I think we all hope that they'll end as quickly as possible.
Good morning. I would like to know what kind of particular measures or concrete policies do you support for Western democracies to implement in dealing with Arab autocracies to pressure for a democratic change and not falling in interference with those countries? Thank you.
Well, I think that the implicit in your question may be the view that it is somehow interference in a country's internal affairs to promote human rights, and I have to say I don't accept that view.
No. I mean, what kind of policies do you support? I mean,
okay.
Which don't have the risk of interfering. I'm not...
Yeah, okay. Well, in my view, every government has a responsibility not only to respect human rights at home, but also to promote human rights around the world. And that means, not actively siding with authoritarian governments, but instead using one's influence to press authoritarian governments to democratize and to respect rights. And there are various ways to do that. I mean, the beginning is to simply speak out, to publicly condemn serious human rights violations. Another is to make sure that a government is not building up repressive security forces. Another would be, that governments are not using their votes at the UN or elsewhere to block efforts at accountability, such as using the International Criminal Court or other forums of justice. So it's hard to speak, more specifically than that without focusing on a particular country. But there are many things that governments can do to legitimately promote human rights that I should say have nothing to do with military intervention, have nothing to do with armed force, but simply are using the regular tools of diplomacy and international fora to promote human rights. And we'd like to see those tools used much more consistently, including today in places like Syria or Bahrain or Yemen.
My question is regarding the increasing xenophobic attacks on foreigners, blaming them for situations in Egypt, and have you specifically looked at that threat to human rights?
Well, we've been very aware of the the attacks on NGOs for not being licensed and receiving foreign funding. Is that what you're referring to? Or?
No, I was really more referring to harassment of journalists, beating up foreigners, the fear of having a gang, grab you on the side street and steal your cameras.
Yes, fair enough.
I think what we've seen is very irresponsible rhetoric on the part of public officials, whether government officials or the military. Ever since Omar Suleiman's speech, where he blamed foreign hands for keeping the Tahrir protests going, this line we've heard again and again after every demonstration, and what it's led to is a number of attacks from citizens against journalists or against foreigners who look like they may be journalists, or against Egyptians who look somewhat foreign or like the activist types. So in the first place, there's obviously an obligation on the part of the authorities to stop this kind of incitement at the very least. And if that incitement amounts to incitement to violence, then we would intervene, because this is one of the few exceptions to free speech where we do take a stance for criminal penalties against that kind of incitement. Other than that, at another level, I think one thing about the NGO investigation that is crucial is that on December 21st, the Minister of Justice said that the investigations into the cabinet violence had shown that there were links between the cabinet, those behind the cabinet violence, and between the investigation into NGOs receiving foreign funding. And that is, again, an extremely irresponsible statement for which there is no basis, but once again part of this broader smear campaign against human rights organizations who've been receiving foreign funding, or of course international organizations operating in Egypt, and has to be viewed within that lens of the attempt to limit space for the human rights community or for demonstrators to continue to mobilize.